What's up, guys? Also Footballtalk here. Back again now the NFL regular season is in the books, and we know what the playoff picture looks like. We'll get to the 18 teams that didn't make it soon once the Super Bowl ends and we progress to off-season content with free agency and then a heavy focus on the draft. But until then, I will obviously focus on postseason action, and to kick things off, I just want to give you my full predictions all the way to Super Bowl LVII. This also acts as a preview of the wildcard round, as games are already locked in, and to some degree probably also going forward, depending on how many of these outcomes I get right, and therefore have eventual matchups actually happening. Either way, I thought it'd be fun to talk about each of these 14 teams a little bit, and preview what we'll see over the next 5 weeks, along with my thoughts on how far everybody will go. I went through all the statistics and actually watched all the games according to how I have things shaken out, which you already got a preview of during the regular season, to provide some perspective on how those may affect what happens when they meet this time around, along with just having better insight on all these teams. I also put out an article last week on the 10 most dominant elements among the playoff field, if you're interested. Some of the numbers mentioned obviously changed a little bit thanks to week 18, but it's still all very much relevant. The link for that will be down below in the video description. So let's dive right into this, and all 6 wildcard matchups are actually rematches from the regular season, including 3 divisional rivalries, and we start on the AFC side of the bracket here, with the LA Chargers at the Jacksonville Jaguars. A head-to-head that we saw all the way back in week 3, when the Jags just steamrolled these guys in LA 38-10. Unfortunately, they would follow up the 2-1 start by losing 5 straight, before winning 7 of the final 9 contests, including this past Saturday night in a de facto AFC South title game, where strip sack and scoop and score turned things around for them and sent the Titans home. The defense really stepped up when needed most, even if they had their issues limiting explosive plays through the air and on the ground for most of the season. Until the start of the 5-game win streak to close out the season, they were average or slightly below in pressure percentage per dropback, but they've now risen all the way to 3rd in the NFL. They have so many bodies that they can send at quarterbacks when they get a chance to dictate terms, and Tyson Campbell has developed into one of the better young corners we have in isolated situations. There's no mystery as to why they've been the number 1 defense in EPA per play over those final 5 weeks. Jacksonville's offense, and Trevor Lawrence in particular, looked rather shaky this past Saturday versus the Bengals, but up to that point, they had shown tremendous growth. Since week 9, T-Law has been like a top 5 quarterback in the league, and the numbers back it up, looking at EPA per play and similar metrics. Doug Peterson and Mike Caldwell have built an offense around him that has made him very comfortable, and they've been very good at finding ways to attack defenses on 3rd downs and in the red zone, with formation diversity and creating leverage advantages for the receivers, using their young quarterback's ability to throw the ball on the move, drill the ball into cover 2 honey holes, and take vertical shots with those high balls, particularly Christian Kirk out of the slot. With the emergence of Evan Ingram and what Travis Etienne can provide as a space player, there's a lot to like about this group, although the Jags have dropped a league-high 36 passes this season. On the other side, the Chargers were pretty underwhelming through 2/3 of the schedule, starting off 6-6 without those moments that would really make you believe in them. That Sunday night win over the Dolphins really changed things for them, as Justin Herbert delivered in some big moments with his full receiving corps back at his disposal, and the defensive staff doing more in terms of creating issues for opponents with game plan specific looks. That was 1 of 4 straight wins before a very weird week 18 loss to the Broncos, where it felt like they should have sat most of the starters, having secured the 5 seed already, but actually kept their guys in for 3 quarters, and saw Mike Williams exiting to the locker room with back spasms. When the Chargers offense hasn't had that group of pass catchers intact, they have been really struggling to find explosive plays, particularly if Herbert can't give Mike those chances down the field, and they don't really have anybody else to rely upon in contested situations. As I mentioned last week in my write-up on the most dangerous elements among playoff teams, where I talked about Herbert's heroics in those gotta-have-it moments, on a down-to-down basis, they've just been disappointing, as a bottom 3 rushing attack with very little diversity, and then Herbert is 31st in both attended and completed air yards per pass attempt. Joe Lombardi's designs and tendencies have been frustrating all year, even though they have looked better recently. Meanwhile, LA's defense has thankfully turned things around to some degree over the last month or so, actually ranking behind only Jacksonville in terms of EPA per play across that 4-game win streak through week 17, even though those were very limited offenses, I would say. You see the coaching staff deploy the personnel accordingly, throw some designer coverages, and just give offenses a bunch of different looks from a front and back end perspective. Unfortunately, they still are too stubborn with the principles of staying in lighter personnel despite the struggles against the run, as only the Bears and Lions have allowed more than the 5.9 yards per play defensively on the season, including a league worst 5.4 yards per rush. Even if Mike Williams is ready to go in this one, who scored the only touchdown for the Bolts back in week 3, he probably won't be close to 100%, and that's just not going to cut it in a matchup with Tyson Campbell, who will make him earn everything out there. The Chargers could get back left tackle Rashawn Slater and Joe Bosa on the edge of their defense, which would be huge. Slater in particular allowed them to slide protections the other way, and none of those speed balls of either corner forcing Herbert to constantly step up and check it down. The Chargers were in a bunch of light boxes when these two teams first met, largely sticking a nickel, even when the Jags brought on 13 personnel late in that game, and James Robinson went untouched to a 50-yard touchdown. That forced those guys in the back 7 to rally to the ball and use the guys void their space, overrunning plays and giving up chunk runs. I think Brandon Staley's crew, especially priding himself on studying and taking advantage of numbers, will need to respect when the Jags use multiple tight end sets and match personnel. Chris Manhertz, I believe, has the second highest ratio of run plays when he's on the field among tight ends, with 200 plus snaps, something that I heard Nate Tice mention on the Athletic Football Show. Ellie did drop or come up just short of making a couple of picks back in week 3, and Lawrence will need to be careful with throwing those out routes late, but I think if they are able to find similar success on the ground as they did in the first meeting, and the defense continues to swarm with a hungry D-line throwing a bunch of games at the Chargers' protection, as good as Herbert is navigating around the pocket, they can continue forcing throws short of the sticks and create stops that way. And the Jags will once again not bite them in the Chargers, use those heavier sets, and try to go play action. The only thing that really worries me in this one is if it's a one-score game late, and Justin gets a chance to put together a drive at the end. But I think Lawrence has risen to a level where he could deliver in that moment himself as well, and there should be less pressure on him with the way that they can be successful in early downs. So I've got the Jaguars winning at home. Next up are the Miami Dolphins at the Buffalo Bills, which that season series has delivered 2 amazing games already, with the Bills just running out of time back in week 3 after that butt punt, if anybody remembers that, of course, and then Josh Allen needing one more second to spike the ball for what would have been likely otherwise a potential 60-yard game-winning field goal attempt. And then in week 15, the Dolphins traveled up to Buffalo for that really fun snow game, where the Bills were able to set up a chip shot game winner in another tightly contested 32-29 affair. The big question for this one, of course, will be if Miami quarterback Tua Tagovailoa will be available due to multiple concussions suffered this season and very much a lack of clarity on the situation. The Dolphins' offense has been one of the top units in the league this season under Mike McDaniel. They are tied for second behind only the Chiefs with 6.1 yards per play offensively, along with actually the Buffalo Bills, thanks to a league best 14 passes of 40 plus yards, but also their run game picking up over the last month plus. They've been heavily based around their ability to use the speed of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, creating windows to attack with Tua in the RPO game and then deeper of more traditional play action, with the signal call's ability to quickly make decisions to deliver the ball, and the anticipation to get it out before the O-line runs into problems. However, they are the worst remaining team in terms of third down efficiency, converting just 36.2% of those situations, because when they do get into those designated dropback situations, protection can become an issue, and Tua doesn't deliver much out of structure necessarily. Defensively, they haven't had nearly the same success as they did the couple of seasons prior under Josh Boyer, as teams have found answers for the cover zero reign, forcing them to shift into more zone coverage and slightly less aggressive blitzing tendencies. I really like the way those guys up front work against the run, allowing just 4.1 yards per carry, with unsung heroes like Zach Sealer, and of course how disruptive Christian Wilkins has been all season long, while they traded for Bradley Chubb mid-season across from Jalen Phillips, and they've been able to create pressure with 4 more consistently. Unfortunately, only the Raiders have forced fewer than the 14 takeaways on the season, and they just haven't been able to dictate games as much on that side of the ball. Meanwhile, the Bills have separated themselves as clearly the number 1 team in overall DVOA, ranking 2nd and 4th respectively on offense and defense, the only team that finished in the regular season top 5 in both, and number 1 in special teams now as well, certainly aided significantly by those 2 kick return touchdowns in the season finale against the Patriots, provided by Nyheim Hines, and they finished the regular season with an NFL best point differential of plus 10.6 per game. The one real issue statistically, only the Texans and Colts have turned the ball over more often than 27 times, which has them with a turnover differential of 0, despite being ahead in games for the most part. No other team relies as heavily on the quarterback, and while Josh Allen has certainly delivered in a major way, he has had those moments of just trying to do a little too much, particularly in the red zone. Still, what we saw against the Patriots this past week, with that touchdown to Stephon Diggs at the pylon that traveled 60 yards through the air from the opposite hash whilst backing up, his arm talent is to a point where he can make throws that break the structure of defenses, and of course he's one of the most effective runners at the position and overall in the league. They just need some of these other complementary weapons to step up, and I hope we see more of James Cook during his playoff run after they spent a second round pick on his explosive skill sets, which we've seen on display more regularly over the latter part of the season. Right now they're the only team converting better than 50% of the third downs, which has a lot to do with Josh, of course, what he can do. The defense has missed that one true difference maker up front since Von Miller was headed for injury reserve, but they do have a lot of bodies that they can throw out there and are a fringe top 10 team in pressure rate, despite being near the bottom blitz rate at below 20%. From a coverage perspective, they're best when they can play zone and really squeeze down routes, forcing quarterbacks to attempt those tight window throws or pull the ball down in order to enable the defensive line to get home. The Dolphins have clearly given the division rivals a lot of issues offensively, with their ability to isolate guys on the back end for Buffalo, who want to play a lot of zone coverage and create windows to attack, where they don't have the speed in the secondary to match up with what Miami has at their disposal. Jalen Waddle ending up one-on-one with the deep middle safety when they rotate to single high looks especially has been deadly, and they really gashed the Bills on the grounds when the weather sort of dictated it to them in Week 15, racking up 188 rushing yards and averaging 7.5 yards per carry. I think we will see more of the traditional I formation and A sets to run the ball out of, and if they have Tua to run the show, they could once again have similar success. I did also like what the Dolphins did to Josh Allen and company in that first matchup specifically, where they quickly punted on the typical pressure-heavy approach in fear of playing all kinds of variations of cover 2 and fooling Josh to some degree with that movement after the snap, where there could have been more interceptions than he actually logged that day. I could see Jawan Holland's range be a major factor a couple of times in this game, whether it's rotating down late in some kind of invert coverage or breaking up a seam shot in the middle of the field open look. Where the Bills may be able to simplify that is going to 21 personnel themselves, but still being able to throw the ball out of those effectively. I truly hope we see Tua in this one and we get another thriller, because otherwise I think the Bills win by double digits here. Obviously his health is the primary focus, and I could see the NFL get involved in the background here to make sure we avoid seeing him potentially suffer another head injury, because they can really risk public perception right now, being that they don't take care of the health of the players. Either way, with the energy I saw in that stadium up in Buffalo, and how the Dolphins barely squeaked into the playoffs, I have to go with them here. The Bills have the better protecting line in true dropback situations, and Josh Allen can deliver more in terms of still attacking downfield and later into plays, as well as on secondary stuff. Bills advance. Which brings us to a final AFC wildcard matchup between the Baltimore Ravens and the Cincinnati Bengals. Obviously the third iteration of this matchup, as the Ravens won on a walk-off field goal by Justin Tucker back in Week 5, and then of course the Bengals took care of business this past Sunday to secure home field advantage in this next one, even though they had officially already secured the division under these weird circumstances. However, most recently Baltimore was playing with the third-string quarterback, and the big storyline coming to this one will be the health of Lamar Jackson, who was playing at an MVP level early on the season, but he's now missed the past 5.5 weeks. The Ravens, somewhat surprisingly, finished the regular season 7th in overall team DVOA, with the offense at 12 being the worst of the 3 units, even though I would definitely argue a lesser schedule has helped them get to those marks. They ultimately rose to 2nd in rushing yards league-wide, and were also tied for 2nd in yards per attempt. That's certainly encouraging to see the run game kick back into gear, especially when they've had J.K. Dobbins at their disposal, who should be ready on Sunday again. The passing offense unfortunately has taken a step back, not only since the injury to Lamar, but even before that, just that receiving corps, which already left things to be desired when they were healthy, only being further decimated, and Greg Roman showing his true colors when they weren't able to run the ball as effectively. I need to see more from a design perspective and building patterns off each other, and Baltimore hasn't been able to put the ball in the paint consistently enough, converting less than 46% of the red zone trips into touchdowns. That's third worst in the league and at the bottom among playoff squads. At the same time, the defense has ascended whilst the offense has taken a nosedive over the latter part of the season. Since the trade for Pro Bowl linebacker Roquan Smith, they rank 5th in overall EPA per play on that side of the ball, and only the 49ers and Titans have surrendered less than the 3.9 yards per rush for the year. They can make you one-dimensional, have become less aggressive in their approach on early downs, and when they do bring pressure in high leverage moments, they trust the guys in the perimeter to get the job done. That can get you burnt, but as long as you're strategic about it, the results are pretty damn good. Baltimore is also very good situationally, ranking top 4 in red zone and third down percentage respectively. On the other side, the Bengals, who finished the regular season number 5 in DVOA as a team, as one of the more efficient offenses in the NFL since that Week 5 matchup at Baltimore actually, when they made a switch in their offensive philosophy, going to almost a pure shotgun approach and overhauling some of their own tendencies. They've been a top 5 unit in dropback and rushing success rate respectively since then, while figuring out answers against too high safety structures, which gave them major issues early in the season. So you can't really play soft zone against them because their spacing has improved and Burrow is so good at attacking that space. But then you also just don't want to leave Chase, Higgins, Boyd, and even the backs to some degree one-on-one. The defense may not blow you away statistically as one of the worst units at creating negative plays, but I've been very impressed with their ability to craft game plans against some of the better offenses around the league and just play sound on a weekly basis. With DJ Reader in the lineup, they've been an elite run defense, holding opponents to just 88 rushing yards per game and 3.8 yards per carry in those games that he's been available for. I love the way that the linebackers are playing right now, consistently being a step early for blockers and forcing the issue, while quickly getting to the landmarks and forcing opponent quarterbacks to progress off those reads. And they can kind of do everything in the back end in terms of being physical when they do go to man and not getting hung up in traffic, understanding where the help and weaknesses are. Plus defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo has some clever tweaks and pressure looks every week based on where he sees the other team have issues. Thanks to that, they are top 3 units in dropback success rate. Now, what can you expect on Sunday? Since the line has moved 4 points in Baltimore's direction compared to what it was in Week 18, despite a very solid performance by the Bengals, I would think Lamar is back in the lineup, and the Ravens certainly present a larger threat on that side of the ball with him. Being able to have that success on the ground, and then an added dimension that he presents in that regard, should make them much more dangerous. With that being said, I still don't know what to make of this passing attack. Other than Mark Andrews, it's a lot of complementary targets, who I don't know if they'll be able to find space, and then Lamar of course hasn't practiced or been able to create chemistry with some of those guys that they've elevated since the injury. Baltimore's defense really settled in after the first half this past Sunday, but the numbers on third down specifically are swayed by the fact that since he tried to run out the clock largely in the second half, the lack of success on the ground in that regard is encouraging to see, but with the 8th lowest pressure percentage in the league and some concerns I have about the guys locked up in coverage other than Marlon Humphrey, I think Joe will continue to find ways to move the chains. Right now the Bengals are just hot, and the Ravens haven't been able to get to where they need to be offensively to be a major threat in the AFC. I think it will come down to the fourth quarter, and if Baltimore gets some kind of game-changing defensive score or play on special teams, maybe they somehow pull this one out, but these are two sides kind of moving in opposite directions, and I can only pick the Bengals here. Now moving on to the NFC side of the bracket, we start things off with the Dallas Cowboys at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The first edition of this matchup is the first removed from now, as the Bucs traveled to Dallas for the first Sunday night game of the season. The visitors ended up winning 19-3, with Dak injuring his hand late in the fourth quarter, which cost them a good month. From that point on, Dallas lost just 3 of the next 15 games, before laying an egg in the regular season finale at Washington. Tampa certainly also stumbled their way in the playoff game at home here, benefiting from a horrendous NFC South, where an 8-9 record was enough to win the crown. The Cowboys have been able to recreate their success on the defensive side of the ball from 2021. They finished the regular season now ranked 2nd in defensive DVOA, forcing a league-high 33 turnovers and pressuring the quarterback at a top 3 rate at just over 25%. They've had the issues against teams that have been able to stick with the run game and not allow the unit to get to a lot of designated passing situations, where those guys up front have to defend the run and can't really tee off as aggressively. The offense has been less consistent due to Dak Prescott being tied for a league high in interceptions despite missing 5 games, even if some of those weren't necessarily his fault, but also just moments of lacking precision and not making Tony Pollard a big enough factor of their game plans. What they have been great is in the red zone, converting a league best 71.3% of those trips into touchdowns, and you like the way that they can go anywhere from 13, 11 personnel, 21 with those 2 tailbacks. Dak forced some of his faults is a very cerebral pocket passer who can quickly work his way through progressions and find answers. Across from them, the Bucs, they are simply dead average across the board statistically, thanks to inconsistent play on both sides of the ball, but especially on offense, and only the Patriots allowing those two Nyheim Hines kick return touchdowns in Week 18 probably saved the Bucs from finishing dead last in special teams DVOA. Among playoff teams, their point differential of minus 45 on the season is the worst mark out there. Unlike public consent and what a certain offensive coordinator would make you believe, yes, I'm looking at you, Baron Leftwich, for saying the numbers aren't that far off when you're literally scoring nearly 12 points less compared to the year prior, and everything points to major regression. People have to get this idea out of their heads that this was another explosive offense led by Tom Brady. Nearly half of the 30-plus yard plays through the air came in that Week 17 affair against the Panthers, and their 5.1 yards per play on that side of the ball is actually the lowest mark among playoff teams, and also tied for 23rd league-wide. A big reason is the fact that they averaged 0.3 yards less per rush than any other squad at a minuscule 3.4. The defense looked dominant early on against the fairly soft schedule, before falling off during the middle of the season and seeing some of the best players struggle. I think they can stop the run at a high rate still, as the top 3 unit in rushing success rate since Week 9, and they've begun to take the ball away again more regularly. To give this offense short fields, they do have several playmakers on that unit who could really show up during this postseason. The single biggest mismatch in this game will be whenever the Cowboys put Micah Parsons on left tackle Donovan Smith, who has had a very rough season, allowing 6 sacks and being penalized 12 times, including a couple of holding calls that took touchdowns off the board for the Bucs. Brady was pressured on a season-high 24% of dropbacks all the way back in Week 1, so even with how great he's been over the course of his career at getting rid of the ball quickly, there is some concern here. Personally, I believe the Bucs kind of stumbled their way into the right formula here to some degree offensively, with the stubbornness of sticking with an inefficient run game, because just not allowing the Cowboys pass rush to really get unleashed has been the key for Washington to beat them, what the Eagles were able to do, and surprise, surprise, when Tampa Bay rolled all over their asses in the season opener, when Leonard Fournette easily had a season-high 127 yards on the ground. Duo right at that interior, then some variations of power will once again be on the menu, and then off that, they can hit those deep shots to isolated receivers on play action from those heavy sets. I thought defensively they had a really good beat on Dallas' passing game in that first matchup, with the linebackers and down safeties frequently crowding windows and making plays on the ball, and they didn't really allow CeeDee Lamb to be a real factor in this game. They can focus on that once again, with Vita Vea controlling the interior and not allowing Dallas to run the ball consistently on early downs. Their linebackers have the speed to handle misdirection against bootlegs, plus then they create some issues for protection with some of the different pressure looks that they throw out there. Whenever I felt like the Bucs were finally starting to figure things out a little bit, they've let me down this season. But I think the Cowboys have some really bad juju coming into this one after the way that they looked in a game that they really wanted to win against the Commanders, who were starting a 5th-round rookie for the first time in his career. I'm not sold on either one of these teams, but ultimately I'm going to trust Brady here, more in late game situations, which is where the offense is kicked into a completely different gear, than Mike McCarthy, who opted to complain about the refs after last year's fiasco at the end of the 49ers game, where they ran a quarterback draw and couldn't spike the ball in time because they actually hindered the refs who needed to spot it first. And Brady is 7-0 in his career versus the Cowboys. So Bucs move on, yet again. Which brings us to our next divisional matchup between the Seattle Seahawks and the San Francisco 49ers. The funny part about this rivalry is that we've seen all 3 San Francisco quarterbacks playing their 2 prior matchups, as Trey Lance fractured his ankle in the first half of Week 2 before Jimmy G took over that one, and then when the Niners secured the NFC West about a month ago up in Seattle, where 7th-round rookie Brock Purdy took care of business. Yet San Francisco won both with a combined score of 40-20, and the Niners are probably the hottest team in football right now, having won 10 straight, while the Seahawks lost 5 of the prior 6 games, before taking care of the wounded Jets and then just finding a way to beat the Rams on an overtime field goal game, along with the Lions helping them out on Sunday night with a win over the Packers to get them the 7th seed. The Seahawks have been one of the surprise teams of 2022, especially with Geno Smith replacing Russell Wilson at quarterback, and looking at what has transpired in Denver, far outplaying his predecessor this season. He is number 1 in completion percentage over expected, and really by any metric you look at, Geno has undoubtedly been a top 10 quarterback in the NFL this season, while the Hawks offense altogether has been a top 10 unit, scoring 24 points a week. Yet Geno has been pressured on more than 22% of dropbacks in 4 of the final 6 contests and sacked 19 times across those, so there are definitely protection issues with a very young line, but when they've been able to make rookie running back Kenneth Walker a legit part of the game plan, a player who can make things happen individually and has true breakaway burst, they've been tough to deal with. I always operate on the idea of correlation over causation, but I think the idea of Seattle being 5-1 in games where he's touched the ball 20 plus times is pretty telling. The issue really has been the Seahawks defense, as only the Bears and Texans, the two teams set to make the first picks of the upcoming draft, who have been in negative game script for most of the season, have surrendered more yards on the ground. Seattle is using a lot of Weisman surfaces, where they ask the linebackers to track the ball carrier and make tackles, and now they just placed Jordan Brooks on injury reserve. Only the Jets have blitzed at a lower rate, and that's just by 0.3%, but I think the last 2 weeks against the Jets and Rams have lifted them from like 25th to about average in pressure rate, where they're relying on Uchenna Nwosu as the alpha, Bruce Irvin in his second stint with Seattle, and a bunch of young guys to make things happen. They really feed on takeaways on that side of the ball, where they are tied for 8th with 25 of those. The 49ers ended the year at the top in defensive DVOA, EP per play, and points allowed per game at just 16.3, but they were also top 6 on offense in all 3 of those categories, as the number 1 attack in EP per play with the quarterback number 3 in the lineup. Since taking over starter for San Francisco, Brock Purdy ranks number 1 in passer rating, yards, and touchdowns per attempt. The turnover differential of plus 13 as a team is 3 better than any other group in the league, and only Buffalo has a slightly better point differential. They've just been a force to be reckoned with in the NFC since they've returned to solid health. Defensive coordinator DeMeco Ryans has that unit flying around the field, with soon-to-be Defensive Player of the Year Nick Bosa taking the lunch money of tackles on a weekly basis. They have incredible range on the second level with Fred Warner and Dre Greenlaw, and the secondary is closing windows in a hurry to disrupt the catch points with their awareness for route patterns and how physical they are in zone coverage. Offensively, their flexibility in personnel is just unmatched. I've said this on multiple occasions now, but when they go to 21 personnel with Juszczyk, Kittle, McCaffrey, Debo and Ayuk on the field, they can easily smash you in the run game from traditional I formation, but then also spread you out and empty and put you in troublesome matchups as defenses have to stay in their base personnel. Kyle Shanahan being the puppet master behind this almost seems unfair. The Niners have also now risen to easily number 1 in the Rules for Footballtalk statistic in terms of starting position of drives for them versus their opponents, because they are actually best in both, something I don't think I've ever seen since I started tracking this, giving them a plus 6.5 yards in that regard, which that positive field position is huge. I get the whole idea of it's tough to beat a team 3 times in a season, and in the 2 most recent such scenarios, we saw the lose of the regular season, the Bucs 2 years ago and the Rams last year, overcome the division rivals and propel themselves forward to a Lombardi trophy. But prior to that, the winner of those 2 first matchups was succeeding at like a 65% rate. Sure, Geno has been great, and the Seahawks seem to always pull some kind of rabbit out of the hat, but I don't really see any area where they have a distinct advantage here. The 49ers are tied for the second highest time of possession, while the Seahawks rank 30th, and San Francisco absolutely dominated in that area in the 2 prior matchups, whilst rushing for a combined 359 yards, even if the per carry numbers didn't look as pretty in the end. Particularly against outside zone, Seattle simply had no answers. You combine that with the fact that the Niners were able to make their opponents completely one-dimensional, and Geno was pressured at an insane 42.5% rate. I don't see how the Hawks can pull this one out, unless Brock Purdy shockingly isn't ready for this moment all of a sudden, and has a couple of costly turnovers to set up short fields. And that brings us to the final matchup of this wildcard round, with the New York Giants at the Minnesota Vikings, a rematch from Week 16, so fairly recent. A game that really went down to the wire as the Giants cut it to a 1-point lead before Minnesota blocked the punt, and then Justin Jefferson had that awesome touchdown on a dig route where he was bracketed. You can go back to my Twitter page if you want to check it out. Then New York answered with a big drive where Saquon broke away in a 4th and 2, before the Vikings did ultimately get a chance to win it late, with a couple more big plays from Jefferson to set up a 61-yard game-winning field goal for Greg Joseph. For the season, the Giants are just 21st in overall DVOA as a team, The offense being 10th is actually the best unit among the three, but what has really held them back is the lack of reliable playmakers on the perimeter, as they rank dead last with just 28 pass plays of 20 plus yards. They've been able to move the ball and score enough by versatility in formation and personnel, clever play designs, and great understanding by Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka for how to attack defensive rules. They've been able to rely heavily on Saquon Barkley, but also Daniel Jones as a runner, and delivering some clutch throws on key downs. Looking through the numbers, I was actually shocked to find out that Jones easily is number one in on-target percentage of his passes. The defensive numbers aren't great, ranking ahead of only the Browns and Packers in rush EPA on the season, which is somewhat surprising when you look at the build-up of the defensive line, but the linebackers are just a mess with their run fits and in coverage, which is why I could see TJ Hawkinson be a key element of Minnesota's game plan. Wink Martindale's philosophy at defensive coordinator has carried over to some degree, collapsing the pocket from all angles, and being alert in man coverage. They don't have many true difference makers, but Dexter Lawrence has had a phenomenal season in the interior, rookie Kayvon Thibodeau has had stretches of dominant play, and Xavier McKinney finally returns to the lineup as the chess piece for that secondary, and they are top 3 in third down percentage as well. That could be crucial here, because the Vikings rank 26th in that regard when it gets to 3rd and 8+, so those obvious passing situations is where they've really struggled. For Minnesota, despite their 13-4 record, they ended the season here in terms of DVOA, 20th on offense, 27th on defense, and 30th on special teams. If they don't beat the Bears in full on tank mode by 16 points in the regular season finale, by all likelihood they finish the regular season with a negative point differential. Kirk Cousins has been hit more than any other quarterback in the league, 140 times if you combine sacks and other hits, speaking to his toughness that he has still been able to deliver pretty darn well, but also their inability to protect in key situations. That's a big reason we saw them get blown out by the Eagles, Cowboys, and the Packers the second time around. The one elite element they do have, and this is one of those things that I broke down in my most recent write-up, is Justin Jefferson, the most complete receiver in all of football right now. We saw him get taken out of games by the Lions and Packers once respectively, because they had a great corner locked up on him and were very well prepared to frequently have a safety bracket that guy, but there were opportunities to get him the ball, and that's where Cousins has to hold himself accountable, which he has taken more shots down the field to a star wideout this year. Minnesota's defense unfortunately has been rough to watch for large stretches, not showing much of a willingness to adapt at Donatell's scheme, which runs a ton of cover 4 and cover 6, where offenses can kind of dictate matchups, and they are in so many light boxes, which is why they've surrendered at least 118 yards on the ground in all but one of the final 10 contests. They have, however, come up with some clutch takeaways, being tied for 8th in that regard with 25 of those. The Giants are blitzing the quarterback at by far the highest rates in the league under Wink, so that could lead to some isolated opportunities for those receivers, but other than Justin Jefferson, the only guy we've seen consistently being able to defeat man coverage is TJ Hawkinson at tight end. So if they can legitimately double J-Jaff in some spots, Minnesota may struggle to consistently extend drives. And yes, they weren't really able to execute that plan in the first matchup, but that was without their top corner and safety, who should both be back this time around. And Dexter Lawrence versus the first-string center for the Vikes could be a major mismatch, to where I see them really ball up Dalvin Cook, who had just 46 yards rushing after literally the very first carry of the game. At the same time, we saw the Giants' offense have some pretty good success when these two squads last met. They averaged 6 yards per rush, and other than a couple of turnovers, they weren't really stopped from the second quarter on. Saquon Barkley caught 8 passes for 49 yards. Getting him isolated versus Jordan Hicks in coverage could be an even bigger part of the game plan this Sunday. As crazy as their 11-0 record in one-score games is, the Vikings may have found the match here in that regard, because not counting the season finale, where they set several key starters and the final score was pretty deceiving, the G-Men are 8-2-1 in such contests themselves, with one of the losses coming at Minnesota a couple of weeks back. I just really like the Giants here, having the front row view at Minnesota already, with a slightly less talented roster, but a better coaching staff and adjusting to their opponents, I believe. So Giants move on. And so do we to the divisional rounds, which sets up 4 matchups here that we've all seen during the regular season as well, even though Bills-Bengals obviously had to be stopped and ultimately cancelled for a horrible reason, as we're still hoping Damar Hamlin can make a full recovery from the cardiac arrest that he suffered in Cincinnati, and by all accounts it appears that he's on his way. We can argue that that game not being played on a neutral field, if that's fair, when Bills Chiefs would be, based on the whole situation of that game being cancelled. But I think we can all agree it's better from a viewing perspective to not go back to that stadium where Damar laid as trainers tried to save his life. But I do want to get back to the actual football now. And let's actually start with the number 1 seed, the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC, hosting the Jacksonville Jaguars. We saw those two teams square off back in Week 10 with a final score of 27-17 in favor of the Chiefs, who will once again play host in the divisional round. Kansas City did jump out to a 20-0 lead after the Jags actually started the game with a surprise onside kick, if anybody can remember that. They punted just twice, but did turn it over 3 times, and if not for a missed 41-yard field goal, the Jags could have maybe actually made this somewhat interesting late. And that was before they actually started to really go on a run, with Trevor Lawrence ascending to a completely different level. Let's say a couple of things about the Chiefs first. Their offense finished the regular season averaging 0.3 yards more per play than any other team at 6.4. Without Tyreek Hill, they've become much better at spreading the ball around and letting Mahomes take the game in his hands even more so, along with some clever, almost ridiculous play designs at times. Since they've gone to 7th-round rookie Isaiah Pacheco as the primary ball carrier, their traditional run game has become more effective, and I feel like the connection with the receiving corps is more natural now, especially in terms of converting routes and creating yards on secondary plays. The Chiefs have been great situationally, ranking 2nd league-wide in 3rd down, 4th down, and red zone percentage, whether they throw some ridiculous trick plays out there or just let Mahomes work his magic. The defense has kind of been up and down throughout the regular season. Chris Jones has been an absolute game wrecker, and he can create major issues for any interior O-line that the Chiefs would face. While the linebackers have played with better conviction, the issues have really been on the back end, with all those young DBs being tested down the field, allowing a passer rating of 95.3 on average. And as good as they've been at converting scoring opportunities offensively themselves, they've also allowed touchdowns in the red zone at the 2nd highest rate at 67.3%. When they've stood out on that side of the ball, it was against those more one-dimensional offenses and when the pass rush could really tee off. Going back to Week 10, I never really felt like Jacksonville's defense actually stopped Mahomes and company. Pacheco fumbled inside the opposing 10-yard line on the first possession. Then Andre Cisco should have actually been flagged for a head-to-head hit, which concussed Juju and led to another fumble. And then later on, a great play by the safety, undercutting a late throw to the back on a scramble drill for a pick. Pacheco ripped off good yardage every time he touched the ball in the first half, and Mahomes was just shredding them on the back end. I pulled a couple of examples of this when I previewed the Chiefs-Bengals matchup at the start of December, where I showed how Kansas City can sort of bend the structure of coverages and break their rules, basically running right at defenders and pulling them away from space, only then to attack that voided area with other receivers. Jacksonville's defensive line will have to display better rush discipline, as they ran a lot of twists and made Mahomes move around, where he's actually more comfortable it seems like at times. He scrambled 5 times for 40 yards that day, and their linebackers, in particular rookie Devin Lloyd, have to do a better job of recognizing guys breaking open behind them and matching them late in the play clock if they aren't assigned with spy duties. Flipping things over to the Jags offense versus the Chiefs defense, the one thing that really stood out to me was how aggressive Kansas City was in the run game. 7 different Chiefs defenders had a tackle for loss, so Jacksonville needs to add some misdirection, maybe a couple of throwback screens added in there, and use the big play ability by Travis Etienne, who ripped off a big play on a cross screen early on. Even with the ascent of Trevor Lawrence, I just don't believe he can quite trade blows with Mahomes quite yet. So running the ball 12 times for 49 yards with the bags this time around won't cut it either. I did like the way that they alternated between condensing formations to challenge man coverage and then spreading out the defense to create matchups that they like. To me, Christian Kirk remains the most prevalent option to take advantage of that secondary that lacks many proven commodities for Kansas City. Lawrence couldn't quite place it perfectly on a corner route early on, but he did punt back to him for a couple of touchdowns back in Week 10. Unfortunately, Chris Jones created issues for everybody along the Jacksonville O-line, and by moving him around, Spags really weaponizes him to a certain degree, while making it harder for their opponents to create a comprehensive plan for how to stop him, or at least slow him down. Ultimately, as much as I like what I've seen at different times from both sides for the Jags, they haven't truly shown that ability to put it all together, and this will be an environment most of these players haven't experienced, against the Kansas City team that has gone to 4 straight AFC championships for a reason. I actually bet Jacksonville to make it to the Super Bowl, at like 25-1 a couple of days ago, because I think they could potentially be one of those surprise teams that catches the Chiefs looking ahead to an eventual rematch with the Bengals or the Bills, for that matter. But it's not enough to convince me they can actually pull this off at Arrowhead, and so I have the Chiefs going back to the title game. And then the second AFC matchup, the Cincinnati Bengals at the Buffalo Bills. Obviously the rematch of that fateful Week 17 Monday night matchup, which was so highly anticipated, and then midway through the first quarter, when the clock was stopped with a score of 7-3 Bengals, with Damar Hamlin laying in the middle of the field, football all of a sudden seemed very secondary. From the very limited sample size we did see with this matchup, it looked like the Bengals couldn't really be stopped on offense, went straight down the field, drawing a flag on a deep shot to Jamar Chase, hitting a seam ball off a power run fake to tight end Hayden Hurst, and then the 14-yard touchdown to Tyler Boyd, where he and Chase kind of flipped where they would line up, so he would be the outside guy on the double post concept, because they knew it would force the safety to quickly jump on Chase, and left the corner one-on-one with a lot of space to cover. The Bills put together a pretty impressive opening drive themselves. I like what Ken Dorsey did to help out Stephon Diggs, once getting him isolated with linebacker Logan Wilson on a little pivot route, and then using tight end Dawson Knox on a rub-like play, where they ran him on a wheel route and Diggs had plenty of space to break inside on a slant route. We also saw James Cook show off his burst on a couple of occasions. They really went deep into the pool of skill position players on just that one drive, using a couple of tight ends, fullback Reggie Gilliam, 3 different tailbacks, and all 5 of the active receivers. That diversity in personnel is something I anticipate being a factor when they meet again, to sort of grab the pen and write their own path. A couple of notes here. One of the legit weaknesses for Cincinnati's defense is their ability to defend the design QB run game. I actually sent out Josh Allen's rushing yard prop of like 46 yards ahead of that game between the two, which obviously didn't finish, but that looked good early on. And the other thing, the Bengals have been responsible for the second fewest penalty yards, while being the beneficiary of the 4th highest mark, while the Bills have kind of had their issues in that regard when facing some of the better offenses around the league. Rookie cornerbacks Christian Benford and Kyle Elam could be on the wrong end of those when locked up with either one of those wideouts on the perimeter. Even Trey White to me lacks that raw speed to hang with those guys, as Burrow went right after him and drew a flag for pass interference on the very first snap a couple of weeks ago. I don't believe it'll be quite as high scoring, because both defenses are very well coached and built to stop big plays, but I could see this being a similarly intriguing matchup as the instant classic of Bills Chiefs in last year's divisional round, and just like we saw that day, this could easily come down to which one of these quarterbacks has the ball last. It sucks that I would have to send either one of these teams home already, because I could absolutely see either go all the way, but I'm ultimately going to go with Buffalo here. At home, this should be the most hyped matchup of the weekend in prime time. Bengals do everything right in some spots, but somehow playoff Josh makes some crazy plays. Cincinnati's offensive line is really banged up right now, without 2 starters most likely, having Lyle Collins on injured reserve, and just now Alex Kappa having his ankle rolled up upon pretty badly. Because of that, I could see Ed Oliver have a big game here, and the way the Bengals want to run the ball out of spread sets actually plays in the favor of Buffalo, who live in nickel personnel, while they do their best to not give Cincinnati's receivers chances to make plays one-on-one on the perimeter. Once again, this really is a toss-up, I feel like, but I slightly lean towards Buffalo here. And I'm going to be moving on to the NFC side of things, where we get to talk about the Philadelphia Eagles for the first time here, the number 1 seed, hosting the New York Giants. Another divisional round matchup between these NFC East rivals. This season there hasn't really been much of a rivalry, however, looking back at Week 14, when Philly demolished them 48-22, and then this past week, even though it was against backups mostly, as New York was locked into the 6th seed, but it never really felt like much of a game, with the Eagles up 16-0 at halftime. Since I haven't really talked about them yet, a few numbers and thoughts on the Eagles here. They are arguably the most complete team in the entire playoffs. The offense can kind of do it all, and what amazes me is how simple they make the game. Having the best offensive line in football, hopefully they can get back all-pro right tackle Lane Johnson, allows them to bludgeon teams on the ground, as well as protect Jalen Hurts to take shots down the field. RPOs, QB run game, cool wrinkles off that, Hurts' ability to drop deep balls into the buckets of those receivers when they're isolated outside. It's tough to really box them in, with how well offensive coordinator Shane Steichen has constructed their plan of attack. And they've been outstanding situationally, as the top 4 in 3rd down, 4th down, and red zone percentage. Meanwhile, the defense is tied for a league low 4.8 yards allowed per play, thanks in large part to creating negative plays at a higher rate than any other team in the league, finishing with the most tackles for loss and 15 more sacks than any other unit. Other than a few issues defending the run, when they've been banged up on the interior, and how teams have been able to attack the 5-man surfaces at times schematically, they've been pretty darn impressive on that side of the ball as well. Having 2 corners that can lock up on the perimeter and aggressive safeties to drive on routes when they're in quarters, combined with what ultimately rose to the top pass rush unit in the league in terms of pressure rate at 25.5%, they finished the regular season tops in EP per dropback. Only taking the games of Jalen Hurts and the center into account, they're also at plus 11 in the turnover department, which would rank behind only the 49ers. I think this is where the miraculous run ends for New York, because literally every single matchup that I go through, I think Philly has the upper hand. Up front, I probably wouldn't pick any other team in the league over them. They have the better quarterback if this were to become more of a shootout type affair, which is not at all how the Giants want to operate on offense anyway. Dallas Goedert against those Giants backers isn't even close. And remember what I said earlier about Big Blue and how we might opt for a strategy of bracketing Justin Jefferson for the Vikings because of a lack of reliable targets around him? Well, you can pick your poison between AJ Brown and Devontae Smith. They'll both burn you. I really don't have that much to add here, other than saying, if you had told Giants fans before the season that they'd win double-digit games and made it to the divisional round, they would have taken that in a heartbeat. Brian Daboll's staff has taken his roster way further already than anybody expected. So yeah, Eagles, and it might not be very close. And then with the other NFC matchup, we got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the San Francisco 49ers. This is a chance for Tom Brady to rectify his last appearance in San Francisco, the team that he rooted for as a child, after the Bucs got shellacked back in Week 14 by the Niners, when there was so much talk about Brock Purdy's first career start, coming against the GOAT and all that, only for the home team to jump out to a 35-0 lead a minute into the second half, before Tampa Bay was able to get a lucky touchdown late. This could actually be a fairly tough matchup for the 49ers offense. I know it didn't look like it when these two sides last met, but they were almost shell-shocked by what Brock Purdy was able to do against them, and some of the play designs by Kyle Shanahan. You saw the Niners use blockers on the move of motion and wrapping around linemen to create angles and open lanes for McCaffrey to explode through for chunk plays. The way they forced that whole back 7 to flow and then cut it up behind guys was on display all afternoon. However, the Bucs since Week 9, if you just take out what happened at San Francisco, would be the number 1 defense in rushing success rate, and they're still number 3 if included. Maybe by attacking the edges, they can continue that success to some degree, and they use the wideouts regularly to ping guys out there in order to set those up. But Vita Vea is not back on the lineup compared to that Week 14 matchup, and they're a completely different beast when he's in there, where he may drive his man backwards and completely blow up plays at times. There wasn't a ton of pressure on Purdy, whether you look at his actual pressure rate at around 18%, or more metaphorically, going 16 of 21 for 185 yards and 2 touchdowns. Tampa Bay was literally daring him to make throws outside the numbers, and to the rookie's credit, he did hit them with that long score to Christian McCaffrey flexed out wide, who ran right by a scoring corner, and also that huge touchdown to Ayuk before the half on a stutter go with a defensive tackle barreling in on the quarterback. The Niners had 5 guys out in the pattern for 2/3 of the dropbacks, but they had a lot of success, although Purdy did get lucky on an interception that did get called back from a ticky-tack defensive hold effectively. And I'd say as dominant as the Niners looked on the broadcast version, going back, the Bucs did have some pretty bad self-inflicted wounds. Ryan Succop missed a 55-yard field goal at the end of the first possession. Then they had that 68-yard touchdown to Mike Evans wiped out of the board by a holding call on the left tackle, which would have tied the score at 7. And the Niners had a really weird coverage bust where the safeties to that side had some late communication where it seemed like they tried to switch responsibilities and let Big Mike run just right by them. Brady was pressured on less than 15% of dropbacks, not allowing those wide 9 rushers to really affect him a whole lot with how quickly he gets the ball out. But the Niners did force him to check it down short of the sticks over and over again. You've got Fred Warner to take away anything between the numbers on that intermediate level and still be able to race down and stop those underneath throws short. That definitely favors San Francisco. The way the Bucs need to win is running the ball effectively enough to where they can take those deep shots off play action and catch guys one-on-one with Mike Evans. I definitely believe this matchup will be a lot closer, but I bet the Niners back when these two teams last met And other than how Brady and company have been able to pull out these games late, the only real difference here is the presence of Vita Vea on the Bucs' interior D-line. I still very much favor San Francisco's ability to have success on the ground. The overall weaponry on offense is more dangerous on that side, particularly with what they can do after the catch. The defense has been tremendous all season long, and I don't believe the quality of coaching staffs is even close here. Now let's go back to the championship game. And let's talk about those conference championships, where in the AFC we get the rematch from last year's divisional round game that we've all been waiting for and expected to end up seeing. We did give a preview of this back in week 6, when the Bills were able to pull off a 24-20 victory at Arrowhead, a game in which they didn't see as many quick strike scores, but both quarterbacks still making incredible plays, and the defense is forcing key turnovers, each with one early in the red zone to set up a bit of a different tone here. Meanwhile, on the NFC side, we get those two heavyweights who didn't get to face off during the regular season. The Eagles look like they were in the driver's seat for this all along, only losing one of the first 14 games, before they dropped a couple without Jalen Hurts on the center, but ultimately were able to secure the bye week when he returned for the season finale. The Niners didn't start off as well, with a shocking loss to Chicago. Looking back in a monsoon was how they kicked off their season, and even when it looked like they were on the right track, following a 3-4 start, they ultimately had to go to the first-string quarterback, yet they were able to end the year with those 10 straight wins, and will now obviously be up to 12 straight. Let's start on the AFC side, with the Buffalo Bills at the Kansas City Chiefs, or at least that's what it'll say on paper, but this would be played at a neutral site, which we don't know yet if it creates any advantages for either side. If you were to draw a direct line between the two stadiums, the two options splitting the distance in half the most closely would actually be Indianapolis, in a dome where we could get those two offenses led by elite quarterbacks on a fast track. That would definitely be fun. Or Chicago, which would probably feel more like it would be at Buffalo or Kansas City in the elements. A couple of things that will be different this time around. Isaiah Pacheco and Kadarius Toney are more prevalent pieces for this Chiefs offense, with Toney being acquired via trade mid-season. For Buffalo, on the other hand, they won of Von Miller this time around, who was a game wrecker back in week 6, with a couple of sacks and tackles for loss each, along with the pressure that forced Mahomes into the game-sealing pick. My biggest takeaway back when I first watched the regular season matchup between the two sides, and also going back to the tape this week, is that the Bills coaching staff outdueled the Chiefs play callers. Ken Dorsey packed some really cool run designs and forced Chiefs defensive coordinator Steve Spagnuolo into using a lot of base personnel, having a fullback and tight end out there, giving them more space to work out of in the passing game. Something we saw a couple of times back in week 6 and hope to try to recreate it is not allowing Spag to dictate where they go in the passing game, forcing them to throw hot when they bring pressure, but rather using some 7-man pass protection and taking the shots down the field when they want to. Meanwhile, the defense used more dime personnel to match up with what the Chiefs threw out there, specifically on third downs, and Matt Milano was frequently deployed as a spy, which weaponized Vaughn back then with having a two-way go against those tackles, because Milano would be in position if Mahomes moved to either side of that. Some drop 8 stuff, and at least that they got from watching what the Bengals were able to have success with in last year's AFC title game, which it will be interesting now how the Chiefs counter that. I know everybody wants to see fireworks here like they did in last year's divisional round affair, and I think with these two quarterbacks, we will absolutely see some of that to a certain degree. But let's not forget the score in that game was 23-21 inside of the final 10 minutes, before things kind of went off the rails and we got 34 points the rest of the way, and the score back in week 6 of course was 24-20 Bills. So in such a heavyweight fight, we could see these teams once again maybe feel their way into the matchup. More run game on early downs when the opposing defense is in two high shells, Spags holding those pressure looks close to his vest until we get to a key third down or red zone situation. In no way would I call it conservative, but taking some jabs early and figuring out how the other side is approaching you. And then we maybe get some of the craziness at the end, where those quarterbacks start to outdo each other. Over the last couple of years, the Bills have won these matchups in the regular season, but then the Chiefs prevailed once they met in the playoffs. I kind of have a feeling this will change here. The Bills don't have to go to Arrowhead. What this coaching matchup looked like back in week 6, how hungry Buffalo seems right now, it just feels right to me. And in a battle of titans like this, I might as well go with my gut. So, Bills move on. And then as we flip over to the NFC with the San Francisco 49ers at the Philadelphia Eagles, The only head-to-head that we haven't seen yet during the regular season, but once again it started to feel more and more like these two NFC powers would eventually collide. The one area of the game that stands out to me right away is how the Eagles may come out in this matchup with the defensive front, and if they maybe change things up a little bit. Because unless big rookie defensive tackle Jordan Davis starts playing more than like a quarter of the snaps and dominates that matchup with center Jake Brendel, I feel like Shanahan will have some stuff to attack those 5-man lines, creating favorable angles and getting blockers on the move and in the faces of those linebackers, with the triple M's, McCaffrey, Mitchell and Mason darting through, along with some of the stuff that they can do with Debo if the Eagles are trying to cheat and now they hit him with some alert bubble or glance route behind it. With how good Philly has been in the drop-back pass game and defense, number one EPA in that regard, Shanahan will need to have a plan to dictate which coverages they'll be facing based on formations and give Purdy easy opportunities where that pass rush doesn't have enough time to get home against an O-line that has a few question marks on the interior in designated passing situations. I think where you really want to make your money in this matchup is taking advantage of the aggressiveness at the safety position for Philadelphia and maybe try to hit Kittle on like a corner post off boot stop action as a change-up for a big play. The Niners defense is tied for a league low 3.4 yards per carry surrendered, so I have a tough time seeing Philadelphia be able to be effective enough on the ground to really build their offense off it, with all the elements they can stack on top, having Jalen pull the ball and then giving them a slide route if he's accounted for. And the whole idea of the RPO game, since that's such a big topic with them, is wanting to put players in a bind. However, if you do this in this matchup, I don't think it's quite as beneficial as you're typically used to, when the guys you're trying to isolate are Fred Warner and Drake Greenlaw, who can shuffle with the run initially and still disrupt the catch point of the targets you're trying to replace them with. San Francisco's corners have played solid, but that's probably the group of the Eagles want to benefit from attacking the most. A formation that they like and have a lot of different variations of plays out of is an ace duo set out of shotgun with a tight end wing to one side with twins across it, where you have AJ and Devontae together and you get two corners over them, most likely forcing the Niners into a single high look. With proper spacing, you can get one of those guys isolated, double posts, scissors, that kind of stuff. I think these are clearly the two best, most complete football teams in the NFC, unless the wildcard round ends up working out differently, and we maybe get a third meeting between the Cowboys and the Eagles, where now Dallas has that familiarity and has shown how effective they can be on offense. I feel pretty good about that we will get to this matchup and see an awesome game. The way I decided this, it's just based on the fact that we have seen Philly stumble a little bit here down the stretch, even if it was without Hurts mostly, while San Francisco has been on a tear, and you have a bunch of guys still from the Super Bowl run from a couple of years ago. It's been smooth sailing for such a long time in the Eagles' case that I just feel like they'll stumble at some point, and against a great 49ers team, you really need to bring your A-game. So Niners go back to the Super Bowl, giving us a matchup between the Bills and the 49ers in Super Bowl 57, which was also my prediction before the season started, so make of that what you like, as I may have had some bias to get here, but either way, this would be a tremendous matchup, one that was a popular Super Bowl pick throughout the 90s, but somehow these two sides never met. I don't want to get into the specifics here too much, because it's so far ahead. Obviously you don't know if this will actually be the two participants, and even if it is, I still would want to dive into the matchup when you do get there, and I put together my in-depth Super Bowl preview. So just a couple of things that came to my head right away when I was looking at this. Something I mentioned a couple of times now with Buffalo, using more pro personnel to get defenses to match with base, won't be as useful in this matchup, because when they do go to a true 4-3, all three of those linebackers for San Francisco can cover ground to where it doesn't create legitimate disadvantages in the pass game. And for San Francisco's offense, they would obviously have a major advantage in the run game, looking at what Mike McDaniel has been able to draw up for Miami against the Bills this season, coming from the coaching tree. So the big question would be if Josh Allen can be patient enough to not force passes into those crowded areas in the Niners zone coverages. Fortunately for Buffalo, if there's one guy capable of throwing lasers into those tight windows and can create stuff off schedule, they have him on the center. And Josh, of course, is a force with the ball in his hands. So I'll just roll with that. Josh certainly being the superior quarterback in this matchup. And while the Niners are obviously on their third guy themselves, the Bills have gone through some real adversity throughout the season. Now they have that added motivation of playing for their brother DeMar Hamlin. I'll just stick with the preseason pick of the Buffalo Bills in another game that could easily go either way. So there you have it, my full 2023 NFL playoff predictions, every matchup with a bunch of information and numbers on each team. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. If you did, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet for future videos like this, and also feel free to share it with a friend or two. That would really help me out. Of course, if you're interested in the article I mentioned a couple of times throughout this preview and all my other content, just head over to my page footballtalk.com, and you can follow me on social media for even more thoughts. Links for that can be found down below in the video description, plus my handles are on the screen right now. I'll be back next week, probably in written form. I usually do an all-rookie team every year, and since we talked about a bunch of the matchups, we'll probably also see in the divisional round here. I think that makes sense. So, until then, see you later. Peace!